What's up, guys? Welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to look at something a little different, and we're going to look at this procedural city generator. Like if you've ever wanted to create some procedural 2D city, something that you can manipulate, make it look like a really nice looking city really quickly and export into multiple formats, this is the video for you. So before we get into it, if at any point in this video you happen to learn something, maybe like it, just demolish that like button. It helps me out a lot. Also, consider subscribing. That does as well. Jumping into it now, I will leave this website down below. It's just something I ran across when I was looking through YouTube, Google. I just found this thing, and it looks great. It's really cool, really easy, great for presentations, really quick schematic designs, something like that. A nice place to put your building on a 2D environment. And there's a little more we could do with 3D, but mainly for 2D purposes. So it's procedural city generator. It's going to literally generate cities for us in seconds that we could look at and just have a lot of parameters that we can mess with to get the type of procedural city that we want. So there's all kinds of instructions here, which I hope to cover a good portion of them at least. But if you want to go through more in-depth tutorials or really just looking at all the information, it's all below here, and really everything you need to know to get going is there. But I'm just going to click Run Generator, and we're going to go. So immediately you're going to see what looks like a bunch of points and dots around here, squares, crosses, like, what is this? Well, this is the beginnings of a procedural city. So all these points are determining what will show up there. Maybe it's a building, maybe it's a road, a river, a park, something like that. And then we have these red squares that we can actually click and move around. And you'll notice ever so slightly that some of these crosses and points are reacting to this red square that I have. And in a sense, if you're familiar with attractor points, if you've worked with parametric modeling and Grasshopper or Dynamo, that's kind of what this is. So these points are determining what's going on to the other points around them parametrically and in a form of like an attractor point. So the attractor being that based on this location, this point, the other points and surrounding elements in this area are reacting in a certain way. And so all of that can be determined through the different parameters that we can choose from up here. But first things first, we've got a few of these points. We can add some more, but we don't necessarily need to. But this is literally infinite. Like I can just scroll wherever I want. I can zoom in and out, and you notice this looks a bit, agonizing to look at. But the main thing here is just the zoom and the really big impact that the zoom has. So up here, the first parameter we have is zoom, and right now it's at 0.8. And as I zoom out, I get, of course, a lower number, and then if I zoom in, I get, of course, a higher number. I'm going to see essentially the same amount of points here, so don't worry about that. But the whole idea of the zoom is that as I zoom out farther, the file's getting bigger, the map's getting larger, but I'm keeping the same information for the buildings, roads, and everything that I have ultimately there. I'm just going to have a lot more of it. So for the sake of this actually running and exporting and doing that correctly, I'm going to keep my zoom at 1 or below just so we can actually see what's going on. I want to keep a few of these points in the view because that would be nice. We could see how these points are starting to affect things. So maybe I'll work with like a 2 or 3 zoom, and you'll start to see what we're going to work with here in just a second. So again, the first thing is zoom, and then I've got this generate button, and I'm going to hold off on that for a second because that will literally generate us an entire city, which is great. I can literally click one button and I get a city. But I'm going to move down to the tensor field, and tensor field basically is just all of these smaller points and how they're reacting and all their settings. So let's click tensor field, and we've got a bunch of settings here. And again, I'm not going to go into all of this, but I'm going to give you a good place to start, and you can start to get a little farther into it yourself, but my hope is that I give you a better place to start. So of course I got reset. I can always reset this, change it, whatever I want. If I do that, it's just going to literally reset everything. And now I didn't necessarily want to do that. Maybe I did want to reset it, maybe not, but I'm going to refresh this again because I didn't really want to reset. I just want to show you what happens whenever I do end up resetting it. So again, let's bring a few of these points in, make sure our zoom is around 2 to 3, something like that. That'll be fine. And once we're there, we've got these 3 points that we're going to work with, and we can start to look at all the other tensor field options. Click tensor field. Of course, I can smooth it if I want. We'll see what that does a little bit later on. I can set this recommended, and all this is going to do is essentially randomize, and I don't know what they would call recommended, but it's going to randomize all these points and what we see on the screen and That's fine. You can do that if you want. I can add a radial and add grid, but before I get into those, let's look at, before I add more, let's look at what we have. So we've got these grids, and I'm not sure what the significance of the numbers are. Of course, this, for some reason, it's starting at 16. If I were to reset it or something like that, it would give me new numbers, and maybe it has everything to do with where I am on the map. I don't know, but we've got these grids, and I can go into these grids, and I can, of course, just remove them. That's fine. I can remove them, no big deal. But if beyond that, I can change the place that they're at. I can literally change these values. And of course, this isn't, I can change it to 1300, and we can see that this moves to the right. And also, if I move this, it's literally doing the same thing as me changing the values over here, just X, Y. I can also, which is really nice, I can click the button and just drag left and right, and I can see that the number is increased or decreased based on where I'm moving. And I can also move it up and down, and it will move it significantly faster, basically higher values a lot quicker. So let's keep that about where it was. It doesn't really matter. The size, so the size is, just literally the size of it. And maybe we want to make it really small, but this, I've seen less impact on the grid size and more impact on the radial size. And you'll see here, because I don't see a lot that's happening when it comes to the grid. Some of the decay, and so you're going to see all of these settings change a lot more when it comes to a radial point, because they apply it a lot more to radial points as it is. Of course, the X and Y changes as I move it. We already went through that. But let's look at the size. If I just move this left and right, you can see how that's impacting that just perfectly. Maybe I want this to be a good value over here, but it's also looking kind of funny here in the middle. And my guess is that has to do with some of the decay. Of course, some of the decay it's basically, the decay is the outer edge and how prominent that outer edge is, if it's going to be really drastic or if it's going to be really smooth. So as I bring this in, you can see there's a definite difference between some of these points and then the rotation of the squares or the X's next to that. And that's just because of my high decay value. And of course, again, it's all procedural, it's all random. You can choose it to be all random, or you can go through each one of these and make it look the way you want. Now, we might want to tweak some of these things after we really generate this, but again, before I do that, I want to make sure that we go through all of these settings first. So we've got the map, and we can generate things. Of course, we can animate. Now, please, if you've gone through this, I don't know what the animate does. It's always on by default. I'm not sure what it does because it's a 2D file. I'm not sure what's animating. Now, if you can make this animate, that'd be sweet. So let me know down in the comments below if you discover what this animate does. I'm curious about that. So water is really great. We can generate the water, of course. We've got all these coastal parameters and river parameters. So by default, you're going to have a coast. You're going to have basically an ocean type effect, and you'll have a river. And now, of course, you can turn those off, but the idea is that maybe you want that involved. So before we get into anything farther, I want to generate this so we can see what we're looking at. I'm going to hit generate here at the top, and this is really cool. I mean, you could see what's going on here. I've got like a river system. I've got some parks in here, some major highways, and I can zoom out, and you can see where the zoom is, what's working here. I can see the edge of everything that I want. And again, I've got my radial point there and everything working off that. Not a huge fan of that, but nonetheless, it's cool. It's really working. Got the river and the roads, all the buildings that show up within. It's, this is looking good. Now, something else, if I hit generate again, I'm going to get an immediately different map. So that's, it is something there. That's something to be aware of, that if you just start randomly generating and continue to generate, you can get a map what you want. But the nice thing is that it's taking all these settings and literally just randomizing the look and location of all the settings that you have. So that's good to know, at least. And so something else too, if I just click generate, I'm going to get a new map. But I can also click this tensor field, and I can immediately go back to all of my points and see what it looks like here. Because maybe I don't want this point being in the middle of a river. Maybe I want it to be over here towards the edge in this little bay area. And as soon as I close the tensor field properties there, I can see that, okay, that it's nice that I can see the map again, basically. So that's good. Of course, if I were to hit generate again, it would re-randomize the location. So I don't necessarily want to do that. I just want to update the location because I just did. I want to update the generation because I moved this point now to this area over here. And judging by the new map, I still haven't found a way to update the current map And as in, if I go back to the tensor field here, I'm not sure how, if I move this point, how I can actually update this location. Because if I go to generate again, of course, I'm going to get a new map. Now, please, let me know in the comment section below if you discover this. Not something I've been able to figure out myself. That's just unfortunate, and that's kind of the way it is. But we're gonna be okay with that. So if we look at the water here, we've got the coastal parameters and we've got noise. So noise is going to be all of these waves that we look and see on the edge of the coast. If I were to turn noise off, I'm just going to get this flat line here. And of course, when I do this and generate it, there's my flat line across the coast there. I can change the noise size and angle if I want to. That's fine. But looking at river parameters, of course, I've got the same thing with noise and all of that, so that's fine. Now, again, this is going to be one other thing, and I hope this is the last, but under all these settings here, I'm not quite sure. Like I'm as far as seed goes, I'm familiar with random seed and how I can get these things to change based on just changing the random seed value. It will give me a different map. But under the dev, like development, whatever tab, I'm curious what all of these do. So if you found out what these do, or if you found that in the instructions below, please let me know in the comments. I didn't end up finding anything on these in particular, but it'd be nice to know. So that's with water, just all the basic settings that you might want to see with the water. We can generate one more time to see. So that's great. The water works there. And finally, let's now go to major and minor. And these are just different parameters that we can work with. And again, I'm not fully sure what these are exactly because we're looking at, parameters, of course, but the same development parameters. So I'm not quite sure. I have a feeling that these major and minor are working with like the major and minor grid lines, coordinates, things like that. Parks is interesting because parks is actually, we're familiar with that, what that is. Of course, we can generate the parks. We can cluster big parks. So you can literally determine the number of parks you want. So maybe I want to see, 4 different, like almost 4 parks, 4 or 5 parks, and, a number of smaller parks. And I can go ahead and generate that. And we can see that we've got a lot more of these parks. We've got a big park here and a couple other smaller parks there. It looks good. And then I can also choose, maybe I want to zoom out a little more so we could see a little bit more. And generate. So there we go. We've got all these different parks here. These are definitely bigger parks. And then all these greens here are like much smaller parks. Okay. Now maybe we want to cluster the big parks so we can really get some nice big looking parks here. So like a kind of a Central Park looking thing. We kind of get it here. We can see the multiple parks showing up there. Definitely clustering them for sure. And, we can see the map is getting huge. Like this is giant. And I would not want to export this just because the size would be huge. But, this is great. And now I'm going to zoom in a little bit more because we're now going to look at buildings. This is very interesting. Of course, I can add buildings or I can just not. I'm going to go ahead and click add buildings so I can get the buildings there. And then I can choose the minimum area that I want for like one of these buildings. And I can, if I bring this up a lot, of course, and click add buildings, it's going to update my buildings. And you can see the buildings themselves are like much larger because they're taking up more area. The minimum area is larger. But I've got the shrink spacing. And now the shrink spacing, it's going to be hard to explain, but I'll be better off showing you. It's basically how many buildings or how many different areas you can fit within one of these plots. And so if I bring this up and I click add buildings, we can see that the shrink spacing, because it's much larger now, I can fit less buildings in there. And so if I were to reduce this, to 1 or below, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend this because of how many buildings we're going to see. When I click add buildings, we're going to get a lot more of these different buildings in one of these blocks, if you will, or one of the plots. So that's cool. You have a lot of control over the buildings and what they look like. Now, obviously, you can see as I click add buildings, it's updating the buildings. Now, let's go ahead and see if I go to tensor field. If I move this point over here, if I'm going to see that update as well. And my guess is no, but we'll see. We'll see. Clicking add buildings. Yeah, that didn't seem to do it, obviously, because I moved that point over there. So I'm not sure how to necessarily update that for sure, but we'll figure it out eventually. So once you're happy with what you might call a map that you're happy with, once you're happy with that, I'm going to generate this a few more times and make sure we are happy with it. And once we are happy with it, we're going to look at the different styles and options that we can work with. So I found a pretty cool map that I am happy with, finally. And we're going to look at the style here. The color scheme is default, and this is what this looks like. And I've got all these different options. Cool. If you're familiar with Apple, you can look at the Apple Dark, Assassin, whatever that is. But what I really like is, Google Maps, looking like Google Maps, paper, if you just drew this out, all these different effects, really cool. And this is just out of the box default. Of course, you can change all this in Photoshop really simply. I can put no zoom in on this, so like we can almost get the look of 3D buildings here. I mean, that's really cool. Really nice stuff. We can show the frame there if we want, the frame of the edge of the map if we want. Really nice to be able to do this really quickly. I don't necessarily like that, but what's cool is the height map. Now, maybe you're taking this into Rhino or something like that, and you want to quickly make a 3D model from this image. Now, this is where it gets cool because I can take all of this information and I can give each one of these different values, these different white and gray values, a different height. And that's just what a height map is going to do that by itself. And that's we can see that if we go into Rhino and do this. Now, I'm going to take it into a different program in just a second, take it into Twinmotion and see what this looks like, because we can import height maps as landscape. It may not be the effect we want, but nonetheless, it's going to import like it would in any other program based on it being a height map. So that's cool. I really like that. Of course, the default looks good, and I would definitely like this information. I definitely like this. It's really great, and I can take this into other programs and start to edit it. And we're going to take it in a couple of more programs and see what we can do with it. So let's take this height map, and we've got more options here. And I always keep the draw center checked, but the high DPI I like to check as well. DPI being dots per inch. It's just going to give you a lot more detail on what you're exporting. And so again, this isn't huge. It's got a lot of water, so it's it's smaller in that sense, but I've got a decent number of buildings. But if we look at our downloads, this is where it gets fun. We can download this, of course, as a PNG file, just as an image file. I've got an SVG, which is great. The fact that I can export this as a vector into Illustrator and make this what I want is awesome. An STL, now again, if I were taking this into Rhino, I could import this as an STL, and I can't necessarily say I'd get like 3D values from it, but maybe you would. Maybe. That'd be sweet if the buildings came in with an elevation to them. Based on what we see in some of the images here, we could see that, this kind of leads me to believe that the STL would give me a bit of a 3D value to it. Now, of course, these look a little more detailed than I would expect this to export as, but nonetheless, it's okay. And then finally, a height map. Really cool. I can export this as a height map. So I'm going to export this as an SVG just in the height map. I'm going to update this here. And again, as a height map, I will do the same thing, and it's going to be a PNG. Again, I'll just save over this file. That's great. So I've got these two files, and now I want to go into Illustrator. And of course, I've got one here already, but I'm going to go ahead and close this and open up my new one. Let's go ahead, and I don't need to do anything really special other than just open the SVG file there. And as soon as I do that, it's because it's a vector, because Illustrator is familiar with this, we're going to get everything here. And again, this is great because these are all individual elements. I can expand this over here to the right, and I can see that all of these elements I can select each individual one. I can select any one that I want, a bunch of them at the same time. I can start to make this look like what I want it to. And maybe I don't want that background to be there, and I can really do anything I want. So maybe I want to change some of these values to be a color, maybe that, of course, and the reason I'd export as a height map is because I have these very specific colors to work with. Of course, at this point, I've selected a gray, and I can go to select and then same and then appearance, and I can get all these different gray colors that are actually the exact same gray color. And, again, maybe I want to change that to this purple color, and I can see that I can start to organize my file in this way. Maybe, again, I'll take this darker one, go to select, same appearance, and maybe we want to make this a green. So you can start to see how useful this tool is. And of course, this is all procedural and random, and it may not work well with the particular building that you want to work with. I'd like to see being able to block out areas for maybe a new building that we're trying to implement, and so we can literally build a city around it. That'd be cool. But of course, the water too. Maybe I want to change this, and I can, of course, select the same appearance, and I can select all the water basically, and change that to maybe a bluish color. That looks good, not bad. And of course, the rivers show up as different because it's not an ocean, that kind of thing. But we can get the same similar, same looking blue. But this is really easy. Really easy, looks good. And at this point, you can bring this into Revit. You can trace this. You can do whatever you want. It's really nice. And I'm not necessarily going to do that. We're going to go back to Twinmotion and see what this looks like once we import it in. That'd be really cool. So I'm in Twinmotion here, and I'm going to go to Import, and I'm going to make sure to go to Landscape. I'll click Open, and we can see that I actually have my real file right there. There's my map.png. That's great. I'll click that. But the options here are very important. So I've messed with this a lot, and I can't say that I necessarily like this, but I've had a lot of crashes recently. And so if I change this value, this landscape largest dimension, to a lower value, a smaller value, I just keep getting crashes. So I'm kind of stuck with dealing with this like as it is. I can change the amplitude maybe to 50 meters, which means that the highest value I would see in that height is going to be 50 meters. And that's fine. I probably don't have buildings that are much taller than that, or at least I don't want to show that. That's fine. The higher this is, the higher the buildings will be and the more variation you'll see between them. That's fine. But the smoothing, I will not smooth this because I want this to appear to be buildings, like squares coming out of the ground instead of like these like arched hills and stuff like that. I don't want that necessarily, so I'm going to turn smoothie off. But something I did notice between multiple exports is that the landscape largest dimension, this value will change based on the zoom value, basically how big or small the actual PNG file is. So that's something to be aware of too. I would keep it smaller, otherwise it's going to be hard to navigate, and you'll see that just in a second, how hard it is to navigate. So I'll click OK. This is going to import whatever. And once it does, we can see that we actually have terrain to work with. And it's absurd. And I would never do this. And I'm actually in a building, but I would never end up doing this, at least in Twinmotion. I would want these things to be buildings rather than landscape. And I can't say there's a good way to make this work unless you're going to make this all one default looking gray material. In a sense, it could work that way, but you could still see that this looks like landscape, which it's terrible. It really is terrible. But I can click this and then choose F, and I can see the whole thing. And you can see now this is where the navigation gets a bit absurd, because I'm all the way out and I'm scrolling the wheel, I'm pressing Shift and Control, and I'm flying so slow it's just absurd. So my hope here is that I get closer to some of these buildings here in a second, and we can start to look at what they look like. But again, these are not buildings. It's landscape in Twinmotion, so that is unfortunate just based on what it is, but it's okay. We can work with this, but I necessarily would not do that within Twinmotion. What I could see myself doing is taking this height map into Rhino and then taking, actually making it a 3D model, and then have all of these buildings show up as buildings rather than landscape, and then bringing that as an FBX into Twinmotion so I could really work with those buildings individually and have them look more like at least gray blocks as like placeholders rather than this, because this isn't quite helpful. But you could see what it's doing. It's really nice that this does work the way you would anticipate that it would. And the unfortunate thing about landscape, again in Twinmotion, is that this isn't considered a material if I choose the picker, and I don't have a material, which is too bad. It's just landscape, and that's the way it is. I can change the different, I really can't change much at all when it comes to this. It just is what it is. And so, again, this is fine. It's not something that's necessarily like. I only brought this in to show you what it looks like, and that it actually can be brought in as a height map within Twinmotion, and it works all the same. So that will do it for this video. If you did happen to enjoy this video, maybe you did learn something, demolish that like button. Also, subscribe. That helps me out too. This is pretty cool. I'm not going to use this every day. I'd probably use this for some sort of schematic design presentation, something like that. It's pretty quick, pretty easy to do, and you have full control over it, not only on the website, but the fact that you can export it as a vector and a height map. You can get all the different colors that you want and make it look right for your presentation. So that will do this video. Hope to see you in the next one. Have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching.